after we were awakened to what was going on in the racial situation, we found out that we had been surrounded by and sometimes ourselves moral people, but who were in a evil social structure. He also helped us see, as Reinhold Niebuhr had, that the difference between a prophet and a statesman. This was something that grew out of a conversation he had had with folks about Barack Obama when people were upset that he wasn't more of a prophet as president. And Mike has been very helpful to show us that he was not a prophet, but he was a statesman and continues to be that today. So those were the two insights that he helped us see from Niebuhr, along with some other helpful thoughts. And Reinhold Niebuhr was a great spirit in the development of the relationship between our faith and political life. So today we come to Jimmy Hawkins, Reverend Jimmy Hawkins, who was the pastor at Covenant Presbyterian Church and my colleague and dear friend, who has now gone on to take a position in Washington for the Presbyterian Church. Jimmy's going to talk a little bit about what he does in Washington, and then lead us into some conversation about Howard Thurman. Jimmy, it's good to hear you, see you, buddy.
Same here, Joe. Glad to be here this evening. So you want me to go ahead?
Yours.
Okay. I'm going to talk just a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes, about the work that we do in Washington, D.C. as it relates, and then we'll move right into Howard Thurman. I'm going to share my screen with you. Mindy, I do need to have my screen enabled. It says host, it's disable screen share. And I think one of the things that's important with the order, as we talked last week about Niebuhr, where Niebuhr said that Christians should approach life with a Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other. I think that Niebuhr was very much of a realist. Thank you, Mindy. I think Thurman's on the other end of the spectrum, oftentimes described as a mystic. And so I think that should be pretty interesting as to look at the comparison and contrast with the two of them. But as Joe shared, I'm the director of the Office of Public Witness. Everyone can see my screen?
Yeah, you're all right there, buddy.
Okay, I've got two screens open, and so I'm going to be looking back and forth. Let me close this one over here. So this is our Office of Public Witness, and I'm not sure how many of you are very aware, but this office has been in existence for the PCUSA for 70 years. So this is our webpage. It's on the Presbyterian Mission Agency and then OPW. We have a video that you can watch, about 6 minutes, to talk about the office. And then this is really the section you want to look at over here on the right. This is where all of our information is found, some of the activities that we do. EAD, Ecumenical Advocacy Days, happens in April. We can connect you with members of Congress if you want to have an audience with them. We talk about the theology of the church, how our office is the Office of Public Witness. We are witnesses to our Christian faith in the public arena. And so it's really from a faith perspective that we do all of our public policy advocacy. Then we have a blog that we put out. This is a 4-week devotional talking about advocacy as discipleship. And one of the pieces I really want you to be aware of is that we have interns. We have an intern now who is a fall intern. She's an undergrad. We will have one in the spring as well. And we also have interns during the summer. Now, we will not have interns during the summer of 2021, but they are paid internships, and we will commence those again in 2020. We also try to engage with young adults. Washington Report is our newsletter, and then we have grassroots advocacy teams. And we also have below where you can see some of the articles that have been written about the office. And this is a webinar here that we do. We also do webinars. So another piece that I'd like you to be aware of is that this is one of the newest pieces that we have put up. It went up a couple of weeks ago on voting. And it's basically voting resources that are put up by the Presbyterian Church through the Office of Public Witness. And so we have here, again, background and purpose of what we're doing, scheduling of events. And we've got an entire week's worth of events that we ask you to participate in as we count down to the election. And then at the bottom, some other resources. So again, this is simply, it says PCUSA You see it here, pcusa.org/vote, and it'll take you directly to this page. And then we also have, this is a focus on voting here. These are 2 documents that the church has put out. The red one, We Shall Not Be Moved, is a manual that the Office of Public Witness put out, and they both talk about voting rights. They're a little dated now. I think this one's around 2012, and this one's maybe 2008, 2010. But again, these are some more resources that are appropriate for this time frame that we're in. Talks about voter registration, voter protection. And again, all of this information is found on the PCUSA webpage. And then this is it's a continuation of the voting rights page that we have, and you can click on some of the links here that'll take you to the first page, and you can register for engaging in the 2020 election here. And then this one is an article that was written about the office, and I really pointed you to this article. This is a webinar that we did on voting rights, and we also have another one that we did on connecting politics, voting with the Bible. So it's really a Bible study that you also can look at. And we can also send you that for your congregation as well. And this last piece of information I want to share with you, this is our Justice newsletter. We have quite a few periodicals in our denomination. We have a wonderful communication department, but Unbound's focus is just on justice. So you can, they're free electronic newsletters that you can read, a lot of different articles. And Lee does a really good job keeping this up to date. As a matter of fact, a lot of work is being done right now around the election. So just some information on the office. Again, we're located in Washington, D.C. We have a staff of 4. Catherine does international issues. Christian does domestic issues. I'm the director, and Annette's our office manager. And I think one other piece that's important is that we work in coalition with other groups which do the same work that we do. Almost every mainline denomination has an Office of Public Witness. And so we are very excited about the opportunities to do ecumenical work. We just released a paper, a statement on we want the elections to be fair, and also praying for nonviolence in the aftermath of the election. That we can also send Mindy and Joe a link to that article. So Joe, is there anything else you wanted me to share about the office?
I think that's great. Let's see, does anybody have any questions for Jimmy about the office? By the way, you have to be really clear that it's not a lobbying office. It's a public witness. Is that right now, Jim?
That's right. We do not do lobbying. We do advocacy. And I'm looking at here so I can see if any screens now. I looked it up online, and there are some spiritual advocacy groups, and then there are some lobbying groups. We basically don't have a lot of the restrictions that lobbyists have because they have guidelines and they have to register as a lobbyist. But some of the work is some of the same, to be honest with you. We do try to influence legislation. We meet with legislators. We don't wine and dine them. We don't, we're not representing any specific group. We are representing the social witness policy positions of the Presbyterian Church, USA. Okay. So how many of you are not very familiar with Howard Thurman? Just kind of quickly raise your hand if you're not very familiar with Thurman at all. Okay. So most of you are. Thurman is, and again, I know Joe sent out the link, but PBS just did a wonderful documentary on him. I think it's about 57 minutes, so it's not very long at all. It came out maybe a couple of months ago. No, it came out in 2019 originally, I think, but you can really get a sense for Thurman and who he is. He's one of the unheralded heroes in Black theological history. Not a lot of people are familiar with him. I've got 4 of his books here. One is, this is his most popular one, Jesus and the Disinherited. I can see right now you can't see him very well at all. And another one's The Creative Encounter. And I'm going to mention those when we go through with this. I want us to start out by watching this video on Thurman. It's about 4 minutes that I got off of YouTube because I want us to have a sense for who he was as a person. He's a very deliberative person. He does not waste his words. He speaks very slowly, very thoughtfully. But I think, and we're going to talk about him being a mystic, wherein spirituality is a strong part of who he is. He focuses in on that. And I think for Presbyterians, a connection with Thurman would do us well, because I do think that we very strongly are people of the mind. We love intellect. We love academia. We love to read. We love to explore. We love to write. And that's why this type of a webinar attracts Presbyterians. But there's also something that we have to learn about the spiritual side of our faith. There's this little joke I heard a couple of decades ago that I love to tell. It says, what do you get when you cross a Presbyterian with a Jehovah's Witness? You get someone who knocks on your door and then has no idea what to say. We don't talk much about our spirituality. You know, we don't talk about how we use this jargon. We have a sense of call when it comes primarily to clergy, but in everyday life of the church, we talk about practical matters. How do we proclaim the good news of the gospel, but really do it in very realistic, meaningful ways, such as missions and charity and outreach and study and dialogue. But when you look at the Eastern religions, they focus more on spirituality, breathing. They focus more on being in touch with nature. And I think that's something that we as Presbyterians, we appreciate, but we don't practice much. I mean, you tell a Presbyterian to meditate, after 30 seconds, it's like, how long is this going to last? I mean, just going on forever. And so, and I think there's something that helps us to get in touch with the divine. And that's Thurman's whole focus, to be not only a physical person, but a spiritual person. So let's watch this 4-minute video.
He's in his 80s, used to be Dean of the Chapel at Boston University. His name, Howard Thurman.
Religious experience is dynamic, it's fluid, it's effervescent, it's yeasty, all these words. But the mind can't handle that. So it has to imprison the religious experience in some way, get it bottled up. Then, when it gets quiet enough, it meaning the religious experience, then the mind draws a bead on it and extracts out of this ferment concepts, notions, dogmas, so that the religious experience will make sense to the mind. But meanwhile, the religious experience goes on experiencing. Therefore, whatever creed there is, whatever theology there is, it's always a little out of date. This is why I feel that once a religion is stated in terms of dogma or intellections, perhaps, then it can become the source of propaganda. It has something that a handle, it can. But as long as the experience is vital, the only way that it can spread is by contagion, not by instruction, not by addressing the mind, but something you catch as you catch the measles, for instance. That's what I mean.
When you speak like this, are you at one with people who would think this way in all traditions? You're not saying a Protestant thing.
No, it's the nature of religious experience, it seems to me, whatever kind it is.
One wall of his office is covered with citations, honorary degrees, awards, and in the middle is a faded photograph of his grandmother, who started life as a slave. He counts her first among those from whom he took his religious contagion.
My grandmother, for instance, who was a young woman when the Civil War was fought, and who therefore was a slave in North Florida, had the responsibility for taking care of us. My father died when I was very small, 7 years old, and my mother became the breadwinner. But my grandmother was the anchor person who held us. And whenever she observed that the water was getting low in my well, or my sister's well, she would tell us something out of her past. And It was the same story always, and we waited for it. She said that when she was a young woman on this plantation, once a year, or maybe more frequent, I don't remember that detail, a slave minister, a minister who was a slave on a neighboring plantation, was permitted to have a religious service for the slaves. And always, it didn't matter what his subject was, he ended his sermon in the same way. She said he would stand and look at them and he would say, "You are not slaves, you're not niggers. You're God's children." And when my grandmother would say this, we would all wait for that moment because a faraway look would come in our eyes and just a slight stiffening of her spine. And there was a contagion which came to us as little children that the creator of existence also created me. And therefore, with that sort of backing, I could absorb all the violences of life.
Okay. You get a sense for his deep quest for spirituality in that conversation. I think, and he was sometimes a critic of religious doctrine, dogma. He was sometimes a critic even of denominations. He's almost to the point where he seemed to believe that it would almost take you away from spirituality, that dogma seems to want to hold you rigid to a certain way of thinking, where he would talk about freeing yourself. So let's look at some of the particulars. And Joe and Mindy, help me. I'm going to try to go. I want to at least save the last 15, 20 minutes for some conversation. So let me know when we get close to where we have about 20 minutes left.
Okay.
Just some facts about him. He was born in 1899, and one of the points again that he talked about was his grandmother was a deeply spiritual, had a deeply spiritual impression upon his life. He grew up in Daytona, Florida, severe segregation. His mother was a domestic worker, his father a railroad worker, and his father died when he was 7. And so he was raised by his maternal grandmother, Nancy, again. And she was a slave until he was 20. And so he really has a strong connection to the transition in American history from being a slave nation, and he lived during most of the civil rights movement. So he saw some major transition in his own life. I think that also had an impact upon him, but he would attribute his grandmother really with being his first teacher, and how she taught him more than all of the classical training that he had. He was married twice, to Katie Kelly and then to Sue Bailey. And Sister Bailey was, she was a renowned person in her own right, was very instrumental in his life and very much a renowned person in the community and in the nation for offering civil rights leadership. Went to Morehouse College, Colgate Rochester Seminary, and then Oberlin School of Theology. So he's very well trained in classical education. His work, he was came out of seminary, got to work as a Baptist minister, and then he went to Morehouse as a professor of religion and director of religious life over the chapel. And then he did something interesting. He co-founded a church in 1943, and it was an intentionally integrated church. And they would really try to bring in people from all races. They had Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, African Americans, European Americans, Native Americans. And it was a small church. As a matter of fact, we'll talk a little later. He tried his best to get King to join that church. And King was real close to his wife. And they had some serious conversations about joining the church. King never did because he was, by that time, when he left seminary, just got fully involved in the movement. But he wanted to make sure, and he was very critical of the Christian church for the racism found in the church. So he wanted to establish what we know as the beloved community. And so he did that for up until beginning in 43. And then in 1933, actually this should be up higher, he was at the Howard Chapel. That's a part of his first call. And then in 1953, he went to Boston University in Morris Chapel. And he was the first African-American chaplain at a majority institution. So who was Howard Thurman? He was a mystic. If you read his writings, they're very spiritually oriented. I mean, and you really have to concentrate on some parts of it to keep up with what he's saying, because it's so very profound. But again, I think he speaks in some languages that modern day Christians might not be familiar with or comfortable with. But his first book, Jesus and the Disinherited, was very mystic, but also talked about racism and segregation to a very large degree. He believed that the most authentic experience of God was found within yourself, that you didn't need anyone to teach you about God, that God had a natural relationship with you. And he said, and he's linked to what in conversation with nature. So, you know, he would believe in being outside and that nature could communicate to you, and you really wanted to link to nature and feel that there's you're a part of the creation. And we see that in all religions. We don't talk about it again as much, but water is so important in every religion. There's no major religion that does not have water as an element. Baptism, a sense of cleansing. You see in churches now, even in Presbyterian churches, Catholic churches have always had running water in the sanctuary, but now you see a lot of Presbyterian churches where people will set out a bowl of water. And you notice in many of our congregations where the clergy are now, even when it's not a baptism, during the assurance of pardon, will dip their hands in water and let the water run down. And so he was very much in touch with that, what we might want to call, he said, spirituality is linked to social transformation. And he says that, but he also linked it with activism. He said, being a mystic does not mean that you separate or isolate yourself from the rest of life. He said that private spiritual cultivation prepared you for deeper public commitments, in particular for social change. So his mysticism linked up with King's activism, and he becomes a major influence on Martin Luther King, even though, interestingly enough, they never carried on a long-term correspondence. They had these periods where they would engage with one another, but he still had a strong impact on King. And down here at the bottom, he talks about how there's a fascinating model about how spiritual and social transformation can work together in a person's life and in society. So one of the things about him is that oftentimes you do see mystics for the monastic way of life, where you form a monastery and you go away from the world because the world is evil and you want to basically purify yourself. He says, no, you purify yourself by going out and changing the world, being engaged in the world. Long before the term interfaith dialogue was common, he worshiped with people of other faiths. So he was not strictly ecumenical, but he was more interfaith. He saw that every religion, whether it was a Christian religion or not, has something to offer, has something to teach us, had some link to the divine that you might not get elsewhere. He told the BBC, this is a quote, "Theologies are inventions of the mind." So again, he was critical of some of the doctrines and the writings that we have, because he thought that it limited you to think a certain way and to see faith in a certain way. He says, but the religious experience will always be one step ahead of dogma because it's dynamic and fluid. And that's a part of his consciousness. He believed that you had to be always trying to continue to grow, almost like the Buddhism understanding of enlightenment, where you're continuously learning. And I think that's a part of who we are as Christians, that we should never be stagnant, and because we are so impacted by our life experience, especially what we learned and what was taught growing up, that we sometimes get locked into that and we can't move forward. And a quote of his is that whether I'm Black, white, Presbyterian, and he did include Presbyterians, Baptist, Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, in the presence of God, all of these categories by which we relate to one another fade away. So he believed in your true humanity, that as you stood before God, you did not stand with a certain identity, but you stood as a child of God. He was a spiritual advisor. Now, he was not actively engaged in the civil rights movement. He didn't make statements about it. He didn't write directly about it. So he was not, you couldn't really call him an activist. And so he was a private man. He was an intellectual. He was a shy man. He didn't lead marches or give dramatic speeches, but he was full of big ideas that changed the world. and he's one of the unacknowledged shapers of 20th century America. Through his sermons at Howard and Boston, he influenced intellectually and spiritually an entire generation that became the leadership of the civil rights movement. So the leadership knew about him, and they knew about his teachings and his writings, especially primarily through King. King would talk about Jesus and the disinherited and share it with the other clergy and layfolk. So this is a changing moment in his life, which really, I think, cemented him upon the path that he was to walk for the rest of his life. He went in 1936 to India and met with Gandhi. And they had a long conversation, a personal encounter. And that's when he really was introduced not only to the idea of nonviolence, but nonviolence as a shaper of social change, where Gandhi talked with him about how nonviolence can indeed bring about justice and to use it as an element in your protest. He saw spiritual cultivation as a necessary accompaniment to social activism. He combined the inner life, the life of passion, the life of fire, with the external life, the life of politics. So he says, so what's inside of you, you have to use it again to engage in the world and not to withdraw from the world. He had a form of spiritual activism that blended contemplation with confrontation, which is really a part of his contribution to theology. He says that, again, you don't contemplate just so that you can grow, so that you can help yourself to be a more righteous person, but you do it to go out, to use what's inside of you to go out and even to confront the forces of evil with, of course, peace, peaceful means, and nonviolence. The discipline of nonviolence required a spiritual commitment and discipline that came from many through self-examination, meditation, and prayer. He was an interesting preacher because just as you saw in that video, how he would pause. And I think it would drive a lot of us today because we don't like empty spaces today. I mean, if you get a preacher up there and he pauses for more than 10 seconds, people are going to start feeling anxious. But he would pause and he would use silence in his preaching. And I think there's something powerful in that because, again, oftentimes we have to fill space with words. And I really reflected on funerals when as I studied Thurman, when we have a funeral and a person in the family is talking about their beloved person who has passed, and they kind of get emotional, they can't talk. It's really interesting to me. Someone has to step in and feel like they have to comfort that person, even almost take over. They want to say something. We get so uncomfortable with emotion, so uncomfortable with really seeing people deal with a sense wherein I'm overcome by my passion right now. And so I think this is part of his contribution that can really help us, wherein to see the power of silence. Again, the power of, and this is one thing I learned from when I did CPE, our training, pastoral counseling training. It talked about the ministry of presence, wherein sometimes you minister to people, not through words, but simply being with them. Just kind of sitting still. And again, I think in our culture and in American society, and even in our training, we learn that that's a bad thing. You don't want too much silence, but oftentimes we fill life with words that are meaningless. And oftentimes we're saying things because we think we need to say something, but I do think we need more of a contemplative reflection on our sharings, wherein we sit and we think about it and then we speak, or we think about it and we don't speak. But they say that he would pause so long in his sermons that sometimes people would think he was in a trance, and he would actually do that while he was preaching, a part of his preaching style. He was a theologian. He embodied what some call a prophetic spirituality. He talked constantly about the inward journey. Again, it's very much like, I think, Eastern religions, Eastern faith. But he wasn't interested in any theology preoccupied with the self. He thought that personal transformation should be accompanied by a burning concern for social justice. So again, you're not on this inward journey just so that you can grow. You're on this inward journey so that you can better connect with others, that you can be in relationship with others, that you can be engaged in the world, that you're not, again, he's saying that you don't want to be a monk. You want to be more of a person who has this inward growth. You're on this path. You're very spiritual. You're in a mystical journey, but you're doing it for the sake of connecting with the world and not withdrawing from the world. And his influences on Martin Luther King, he was actually much older than King. He was 30 years older. He was closer to King's father's age. Matter of fact, they were the same age. And when he became the dean at Boston University's Marsh Chapel, King was enrolled at Boston University. So that's how they first encountered one another. King was studying for his doctorate, and he would attend the chapel services and take notes while Thurman preached. King would stop by their house, not necessarily to engage in theological conversation, but they would watch Jackie Robinson play on baseball. So they had this formal, informal conversation. So it seemed like he was more of a fatherly presence to King, because King's father was pretty austere. It's not the type. He disagreed with King, some of his engagement with the civil rights movement. He wanted King to come and be his co-pastor, first his junior pastor, but then his co-pastor at Ebenezer. And he didn't really agree with all of the paths, especially when it became dangerous for King. He was very concerned about his son. But Thurman was someone that obviously King just liked being around. I don't know if you ever met someone who was entirely mystical. I got to meet Lawrence Bottoms when I first went to seminary back in the 90s. Lawrence Bottoms was the first, I think he's the only African-American moderator for the Presbyterian Church in the US, for the Southern Presbyterian Church. And he just reminded me so much of Thurman. I mean, I went there to talk to him about whether I wanted to do my summer internship at Hillside Presbyterian Church. And I left the conversation and I said, I still remember very strongly, I have no idea what that man was talking about. I mean, he was just so profound. I mean, he was talking about things that I really never thought about. And he was talking, and this is just an informal conversation. I think that's the kind of impact that Thurman had on King. Just being around him was a spiritual experience, whether you're watching a ball game or you're having a serious conversation. It was, again, after Thurman's trip to India, he called it a pilgrimage of friendship. He met Gandhi, who was influential in incorporating the principles of nonviolence in the African-American freedom struggle. So that's what Thurman brought back to the US. And it's believed that Thurman influenced King on this whole understanding of nonviolence, that he planted that seed in King when he came back, because he talked about it constantly, what it was like. It was interesting. Went away from it. Let's see. Okay. It was a long conversation between Gandhi and Thurman. Gandhi told Thurman, and this is a quote from Thurman, says, "It may be that through the Negroes, that the unadulterated message of nonviolence will be delivered to the world." So he was basically giving Thurman a charge, saying, take this concept of nonviolence and use the African Americans in America to spread the message around the world. And it's an interesting encounter that they had, because again, Thurman was already on this path, but I think Gandhi really planted within him a seed that really grew and blossomed throughout the rest of his life. I don't think he was ever the same after he met Gandhi and came back to the United States, and really committed to spirituality and physically integrated society into the methods of Gandhians nonviolence, served as major influences in King's life and also in Thurman's life. Again, he's the first African-American to meet with Gandhi. He was called, Gandhi charged him to create a new version of American Christianity, that it rejected self-imposed racial and religious boundaries to confront social injustice. Gandhi's practice of, I'm not even gonna try, of soul force had a momentous impact on Thurman, showing him the effectiveness of nonviolence resistance. After the journey, Gandhi translated into a Black Christian context, which became one of the key inspirations for the civil rights movement. And Thurman's commitment to a spiritually and physically integrated society and to the methods of Gandhi, nonviolence served as major influences in King's life. This basically just says about the conversation wherein King would have about joining their church, especially with his wife. But the second paragraph is when King got stabbed in 1958. And we all know King himself talked about how his doctors told him that if he had sneezed, that the letter opener that she stabbed him with would have punctured his heart and he would have died. And Thurman talked about how that same period, he had this vibrant sensation here where King jumped into his mind and would not leave. And so he went to meet with King while he was recuperating, and he urged him not to rush to get back into the movement. He said, take at least 2 weeks and just spend some time in meditation, some time in prayer, because he was concerned that the movement was taking over King's life in a detrimental way, wherein rather than re-energizing him and revitalizing him, it was actually draining his energy from him. So that's, and interestingly enough, Thurman said this is the first time they ever really had a very, quote, serious talk. And King promised him that he would, and King took some time and spent it in prayer and meditation and in writing. It's well known that King carried a copy of Jesus and the Disinherited with him. It's reflected in his speeches where he would pull out quotes from Thurman, and that it really was a guide and a sense of inspiration for him, especially in some of the down moments in his life. We see in his sermons of the 50s and 60s that he quoted and paraphrased Thurman extensively. King understood Jesus as a friend and ally of the dispossessed, is what he got from the book, about how this first century Jewish Palestinian was basically an oppressed person, that he was a part of the disinherited. And yet God, rather than the ways oftentimes that racist theology talks about how God is a God that sanctions oppression and racial segregation and racism. Thurman was talking about, no, God is actually on the side of the oppressed. And again, very similar to what James Cone talked about in this book, Black Theology, Black Liberation, this whole concept. And I've got to add this, and I've said this before about Cone's book, that Cone did not originate that theological framework. Cone was basically regurgitating the theology of the Black church. And he was the first to write it down, but he did not come up with it, and neither did Thurman. That's since slavery days, and since Blacks first started becoming Christians, they really held on to the liberation motif that was found in scripture. Again, the book of Exodus, we made mention of this before, how Jesus identified with the lost, how Jesus basically went out into the world. He didn't stay in the synagogue, but he went out and engaged lepers and people considered unclean. He dialogued with women. He went into the house of Mary and Martha with just the three of them there, and Martha sitting there at his feet as a disciple. This was considered highly a scandal in those days. You did not do that type of thing. And women not only did not have the right to speak to men who were not their husbands or brothers. And we see that reflected in Paul. Paul says, if a woman has a question in church, let her go home, wait till she gets home and ask her husband. And so that's Jewish theology. And a woman especially did not approach a rabbi. And so we see that Jesus broke down all of these barriers, and the Black church appropriated all of this. And so what Thurman and what King did was that they basically put it to pen and wrote down the theology of the Black church in a way that could be shared with others. These are his books. These are just a few of them. He actually has doubled this number of books, but some of the ones that are more famous, Jesus and Disinherited, was written as early as 49, Deepest Hunger in 51, The Creative Encounter in 54, The Growing Edge in 56, and The Luminous Darkness in 65. Again, I'm going to go ahead and speed up because we get close to our discussion time. This is basically talks about his first book. His most important theological work, and it's a condemnation of an otherworldly Christianity, which talks about God being on the side of the strong and the powerful against the weak. Vincent Harding, who wrote the foreword, basically says it's the centerpiece of the Black prophet mystics' lifelong attempt to bring the harrowing beauty of the African-American experience into deep engagement with what he called the religion of Jesus. Basically, Jesus is on the side of the oppressed. His relevance for today, I think what he really brings to us is to bring a spiritual sense of guidance for the physical world. Where again, we're not called to begin this journey of spirituality, of trying to discern the spiritual in the world and in our life, and how to connect with God and with the divine, just for our own growth, our own perfection, our own sense of connecting with God, but in order to connect with the wider world. He offered a transcendent vision of our world. His published and unpublished works traced his struggle with a focus on the manifestations of violence and hatred. He was really dismayed by hatred and racial hatred, but he didn't understand how people would hate one another and mistreat one another and oppress one another simply for greed, simply for money, simply for power. That dismayed him, and I think that was his life mission, to challenge that. And again, this last paragraph, his words remind us that out of religious faith emerges social responsibility and the power to transform lives. And these are some quotes. So I'm going to stop here, and I can send this PowerPoint to Joe and to Mindy, so that if anyone wants a copy of it. Okay, so I think we have, about 15 minutes left.
Wow, Jimmy, that was very interesting. I'll tell you, I'm moved by Howard Thurman and also about his role. I guess, Jimmy, if I was to start off with a question, it seems to me that what Thurman was teaching and how he influenced King was to say, if you're going to be involved in expressing your life, your faith in the community, you have to have some inner strength to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't, you'll burn out and you'll be gone in a minute. And I was really interested in your conversation about how he counseled King after King had been stabbed to take some time to put himself together spiritually. And I thought that was a very moving thing, because King, you can imagine what King was like. He was always on the go and going one place to the other.
Absolutely.
So how does he find his spiritual core and his center? And Thurman was helpful in that. All right, I'm going to throw it open to other people. Who has other questions or comments about this? This was fascinating.
And I think King, he would probably say the same thing to William Barber and to Liz Steele Harris today,
Yep.
because they are somewhere every week. I mean, up until the pandemic hit. And I do think he's on to something. I really, really do. That's really kind of the purpose of the church. I know in the Black tradition, we say, well, we go to church so that I can get my batteries recharged to go back into the face of the world.
Yeah.
But we actually, I think there's something powerful in when we go to church and we stop everything. We say, cut off your phones, don't answer any emails, any texts. And we also have this concept of a retreat. Now, I will say in the Presbyterian Church, and I know people have questions, I like the idea that we're starting to now almost mandate sabbaticals. I think that's a powerful experience. And the powerful part, I think, Mindy, you got a Lilly, didn't you? And part of that Lilly Foundation, they say, don't have a period where you don't do anything. Don't fill up your schedule trying to feel like you have to spend this money. But I think that's a powerful experience. So this whole sense of sabbatical where you just stop, where you really get in touch with where you are in life. And they say, think about your ministry, but don't think about it all the time. And so that's something, again, in the Reformed faith, I think we've got to try to connect to, that this is not just an ideological path we're on. It's not just about having the correct amount of knowledge. It's about being in touch with a God that we say God is a spirit. And really that means God is unlike anything we have ever experienced. And one of the parts that I really encounter God is when the wind is blowing on a strong day. And that's kind of, I'm saying that's the Holy Spirit blowing. I can't see it. I can't control it. I can't touch it. But I can feel it and I know it's there. And as a matter of fact, on a cool day, it refreshes me and brings something vital that I need.
Other comments or questions? I was struck by the fact that in the video that you sent us, Jimmy, that Thurman talked to trees. He had this relationship with this tree that he talked to, and I started thinking, man, there's something here that I missed out on.
Almost like
John Lewis preached to chickens,
uh-huh.
and Howard Thurman talked to trees. And I say that was they connected their faith and their activism and all to the natural world.
And if I could now, I'm going to keep talking unless people butt in.
I have a quick question. Did Thurman have an ongoing relationship with Gandhi when he returned to the United States?
Yeah, I'm not seeing any evidence that they did. I think it was the trip really was, it impacted Thurman so much that he talked about the rest of his life. So I don't know if anyone else, I'm not seeing any other correspondence that they had back and forth.
Jimmy, talk a little bit about nonviolence. There's a.
We have a question. Celia has a question.
Okay.
Yes, Celia.
I want to say I'm too much of a starchy Presbyterian to be comfortable with the term mystic. Once I started reading about Thurman, I thought, and he accepted this. He thought this was an accurate description. I wanted to say he was contemplative. Did he embrace this appellation that he was mystic? I need to be more tolerant of it.
Yeah, most of it is projected onto him. I think more people describe him as a mystic. I don't know whether it was a part of his vocabulary or not. You don't see it in a lot of his writings, but I don't think he would object to the way we describe a mystic being projected towards him. I don't think he had those negative connotations of what it meant to be a mystic, because he was very mystical. Again, spirituality dominated his life. I mean, you would have a conversation with him in his office, and if a piece of paper fell on the floor, he could start talking about how the spirit is present in that room, and and how there's a connection between all things. So I don't think he would object to being labeled as a mystic, but I think he would take it further, that he was a mystic, again, not for his own. This is what I think different connotation is. It was not, again, so he could grow. It was so that he could really connect with the world more. And I got to tell my story real quick about, was there someone else that had a question?
Patrice might have one.
Okay.
Yes.
I didn't have a question. Hi, Minnie. I had a comment about the trees. I remember going, Joe, where you spent some time, to one of the plantations right near Charleston, and those big oak trees on plantations with the moss, and being right there near the slave quarters. It's like those trees told stories, and it wasn't like just any tree. And I know each time you see those pictures of the tree with Thurman, it was one of those big oak trees. I'm thinking that his, just his history with his grandmother and slave narratives and being from the South and segregation, that a lot of the winding and the power and the story of those trees had something to do with ability to really get something spiritual out of them. It was a spiritual experience for me.
Right. Do you want to respond to that, Jimmy? I do think we have some other questions. So.
Yeah, go to the other questions, because I think that speaks for itself. I agree with Patrice. I think
exactly. Right. I do too. And if you do have a question, if you unmute yourself, then I will be able to see that you're unmuted and I'll call on you. I believe that maybe Pierre is on a phone call number there.
Yes. Thank you so much. I was unable to get on my pad, but I have related so much to this story of Thurman, and I like to just speak to Reverend Jimmy Hawkins. I'm so happy to hear your voice. I've missed your sermons at Covenant, but I relate to that whole talking to trees. I trimmed trees in Florida for about 40 years, And I discovered early on, sometimes when I was having great difficulty in figuring out how to prune the tree or just get through the day, I spoke to the trees. The Cubans down in Miami would talk about talking to trees. So I think it makes perfect sense. And also in this whole conversation about mystic, I think in the Bible it speaks of the mystery of God. And so I find that aligns with our faith walk. Today in our Sunday school, there was a word in our study book, intrapersonal, which spoke about this internal dialogue. And I think that prepares us to step out into the interpersonal. So I just want to say I just really thoroughly enjoyed this. I thank Mary White for turning me on to this today, and thank y'all so much.
Well, Mindy, I'm going to tell my story now.
Yes, you can. Go for it.
I grew up in the church. I mean, in very traditional church, we would have Sunday school, and everything was done inside of the four walls, and we studied the Bible and scripture and music and preaching. But I really connected with God when I started working at summer camp. I mean, I never went to summer camp in my life. As a matter of fact, when I started working at Presbyterian Point, it was a sailing camp and a canoeing camp. I couldn't even swim. I was definitely afraid of water. But something happened every summer, and it was highly spiritual. I mean, just being outside and being in the water. And it was a church camp, Presbyterian camp. We had devotions every day, big worships on Sunday and on Mondays. But it was just being there. And so I do think that we've got to try to reconnect with we use the term nature oftentimes, but biblically we talk about creation. We are a part of God's creation. We're not any better, we're not any worse. And that's part of how we're in this situation we're in today with global warming, is that we have disconnected ourselves from creation, that we see it as something to be conquered, something for our benefit only. But if creation dies, we die. We are intimately connected. I think God intentionally created it that way. And again, there's something about being outside. We used to have a joint service with Church of the Wreck in Chapel Hill. In the first 5 or 6 years, we would do this joint service, always on World Communion Sunday. We'd be outside in the park at Piney Woods Park. And it would be just so powerful, especially on those days when the wind would pick up and we're out up under this shelter, but we would combine, and it was just so spiritual. And so I do think there's something about wherein we have become such a industrialist, a commercial society. We're here on Zoom right now, not because we choose to be, because we're kind of limited right now, but we cannot go back to the way things are. And I think that's part of our disconnect with one another, that we have disconnected ourselves from creation.
Are there other questions?
Yes, I think Mary Jo, or
another quick one, I think. Just it's interesting to me that Thurman was Baptist. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
How did the Baptists take to him?
Same way everybody else did. They thought he was strange. He's just, again, this individual. I don't see any disruption in his relationship with the Baptists, but also I don't think he necessarily gravitated towards them. I think it was the denomination he have been in, but more of his ministry was on college campuses to a wide array of students. And so I think everyone right now, he's being pretty revered by everyone, especially those who studied theology. And I think he's having a revitalization in his presence in the world. But the Baptist, he's the kind of the old strange guy. You go and talk to him, you start talking about the wind and stuff along that line.
Jimmy, I think also there's something different when you talk about Baptists in the Black tradition than it is in the Southern Baptist tradition. I think the Baptist Black church is a pretty powerful force. and has been for social change. Am I right about
Yeah.
that?
Oh yeah, no question about that. That part they definitely identify with. Now, of course, we have to, when you talk about the Black Baptist tradition, not all of them agree with King. You know, King actually had to leave his denomination and start a new denomination because the leadership said, no, we don't want you to bring that mess up in here. We don't want to start talking about being a part of the civil rights movement. We've got our own movements that are going on. We're trying to work within the system, and you out here telling people to go out in the street. So, you know, I think Thurman disagreed strongly with that. He definitely saw the validity of the civil rights movement. And again, what I think his uniqueness is that he was able to connect where he was as a theologian with what was going on in the streets for social justice. That this is a part of that journey. I'm not disconnecting from this. I think that you can come here, talk to me, and I can help guide you on how to do better your protest and your justice movement.
Patrice, did you have something?
I just had a question for Jimmy or anyone.
Madge had a question too.
End of the video, there was a quote that says, all social issues are temporary and brief, go deep. And I was just wondering if you could comment on what that says to you. I've been struggling with that line.
Yeah, state it again, Patrice, so we can hear it again.
It says all social issues are temporary and brief, go deep.
Yeah, what I'm hearing is, and others can, anyone else want to comment before Homer, is there some, you want to give some feedback on that? You're the doctorate here. But yeah, because I don't mind. Yeah, what I'm hearing is that the things that separate us are superficial.
Mm-hmm.
The things that we allow to be divisive, such as race, sexuality, are temporary and brief. And he's saying that we, in our walk, our spiritual journey, to go deeper than that, to really explore what are the things that are important to God, such as injustice. I think God, you know, I love the passage where Jesus criticized the Pharisees and the scribes in Matthew 23:23. He says, you've done the lighter matters of engagement with the divine, such as going to church, paying your tithes. He says, but you must deal with the weightier matters, such as justice and mercy and faithfulness. So I think he's telling us to be able to look beyond the things that other people see as problematic and have a deeper understanding. Homer, were you about to say something? Did you?
Yeah, I was going to say, Jimmy, that in Jesus and the Disinherited, Thurman talked a lot about how in the African-American community, there might be a desire to live in fear and to live in hatred, given the kind of violence and discrimination and oppression that African Americans live in. And his response to that was that the only way to deal effectively with that kind of fear and hatred would be to go inside, and to go inside spiritually, so that you get in touch with what it means to be a child of God. And you understand what it means for you to live in God's kingdom, in the realm of God. And if you can get in touch with that in a deep way, you can transcend, deal with, overcome whatever Patrice referenced as brief and limited life experience that is tragic and oppressive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it just reminds me of, again, Buddhism. You know, the Buddha talked about this sense of enlightenment, where you really discover what are the important things that really matter. And I think Thurman would identify with a connection with Buddhism. But thanks for sharing that from his book.
Madge has a question or comment.
I'm just so grateful for this, and I'm trying to absorb everything that everyone's saying. And I'm really remembering what you shared with us about his reaction when his grandmother, I think, would share stories of her slave experiences, and that about I could absorb all the violences of life. And then what you just said about if a piece of paper would drop in his office, he would go somewhere with that in that moment, and the wind, the Holy Spirit, and you mentioned the wind. Is there something in this preparation? I'm always so anxious about helping change happen. But there's something in this, isn't there, about the sufficiency of God, about us seeing it and standing in it and holding on to that sufficiency for change, not for stagnation? That's a question, I hope.
Yeah, I think exactly, because we are taught in our culture to always want more. There's always something that we don't have. And I mean, we have a culture that's always rushing towards the newest thing. The iPhone 12 just came out, and this phone's going to cost between $700 and $1,000. Now the reviews are saying there's nothing new in this phone. Nothing new. They say it's just basically, they made a couple of mechanical adjustments, but it's the same phone, but people are going to stand in line all night to buy this phone because it makes them feel that they're for some reason, I can't understand, it provides meaning and gives them energy. They feel good about themselves. But exactly what you say, we've got to understand that everything, I think Thurman would say this, everything that we need to spiritually grow, we already have. It's within us. We just have to be able to find a way to get in touch with it. And it's not Gnosticism, but the divinity that God has planted within us. And I think there's something to that. And again, I think part of my ways of relating to Thurman, like what he told King, just stop. Use some time to do nothing. Use some time wherein you really separate yourself from all the voices that are speaking to you, all the input that you have, and just spend some time in contemplative prayer. And again, I think that's hard for us in the 21st century. If someone told us, we want you to spend all day in prayer, for most of us, that's an impossibility. We cannot, a day, if you say an hour, that's a challenge. But I think there's something wrong with that, where we can't take one day out of 365 days of the year and say, I'm just going to do this day in prayer and meditation and really in nothingness, to hopefully that the divine will reach out to me, and that where we have a connect. I think the Native Americans, we've heard stories about how they would send their young males out and say, you can't come back until you have a vision. Sitting Bull had this vision of a bull was sitting, so he was able to come back. But I think that's part of where it is that you go out and through hunger, we call it fasting today, through being out in the elements, and you connect with that thing that's trying to connect with you. The problem is not that God is not connecting with us. We have so many barriers up that are preventing God from penetrating the innermost parts of ourselves. And so I do think we've got to find ways to hear the voice of God. And again, it's a journey. It's not one thing that you do. And for many of us, it would be different. But for me, again, it's being outside. I'm energized when I'm out, especially if it was a cool, nice day. Oh my Lord, there's nothing better. I'm in heaven then. But find the ways in which you can personally connect with God. What feeds you in a way that you can't explain, that no one else would relate to? That if you explain it to them, they will say, really? But I think that's part of this journey. And that's why we read scripture. We're trying to say, God, speak to me through these pages, through these words. But I do think it's just as important if we had to live our lives without the words of scripture, that we still would hear the words of scripture. We still would hear the word of God. Okay, Minnie.
Yeah, I have a question in the chat from Mary White, and she writes, Reverend Hawkins, is there at least one special quotation that people love and remember from Thurman? Or perhaps some thought that King may have developed from Thurman's thinking? What about the long arc of the universe quote? I will say, Jimmy, I will say we've used one of his prayers as our closing prayer in worship a number of times kind of over the summer. And it's the one that's open unto me, light for my darkness, courage for my weakness. I can't quote it exactly, but and it's a repetitive open unto me this in this situation, and it ends up saying, "Oh Lord, open unto me." I mean, so that's one that comes to my mind as a it's not a quote, it's just a poem that a prayer that stays with me.
Yeah, because Mary, to answer your question bluntly, I've not heard one quote repeated in a lot of different places, but I do have some in the PowerPoint, and I can read you this one. It's kind of simple, kind of easy to remember. He says, "Don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive and go do it. Because what the world needs are people who have come alive." So I think that's kind of like the central theme that's ongoing. But you know, if you were to pick up his book, there were a lot of things I think that would speak to us individual. But I think this is one. Again, he says, don't ask what the world needs. Find out what gives you energy, what gives you vitality, and then go and do it, because the world needs people who are alive.
Jimmy, Howard Thurman has a book about Christmas and about the meaning of light. It's a wonderful book, but it has a piece in it that really was very transformative to me. It really was very moving when I first read it, and I've used it a lot in my life. It's called The Work of Christmas.
Mm.
When the song of the angels is stilled, when the star in the sky is gone, when the kings and the princes are home, when the shepherds are back in with their flock, the work of Christmas begins. To find the lost, to heal the broken, to feed the hungry, to release the prisoner, to rebuild the nations, to bring peace among brothers, and to make music in the heart.
Mm-hmm.
And that last one was powerful, to make music in the heart.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Jimmy, one more comment I'd love you to speak to. You talked about Gandhi and nonviolence, and what really happened when King adopted nonviolence, which was influenced by Thurman and by Gandhi. It was really a radically different approach in a society that dealt with things mostly with violence and force. Mm-hmm. Nonviolence was. And one of the things that I remember very strongly is that every time there would be a march or a movement or something big, there would always be a spiritual gathering before in the church. Mm-hmm. Somebody would preach, somebody would try to touch the heart and spirit of people, to give them the courage and the strength to go forward. That was, and I think that was probably an influence of Howard Thurman.
Yeah, and I really think because of Thurman, that King was able to hold on to the whole theme of nonviolence throughout his life. I mean, he did not move from it. And you, especially when you look at the end of his life, when he was being challenged by the Black Power movement, they were saying, you know, we're sick and tired of this nonviolent stuff. And especially when he approached Black African Americans in the North, they were like, you know, Malcolm X is our guy. You know, you come up here talking about this nonviolence. And King talked about how he went to Chicago, and that was the most violent encounter he had ever had in his life. King held on to it, I think, and again, at the period in Black history that King came along talking about nonviolence, it was when the Black protest movement was becoming more responsive to violence. We had these World War II veterans who, many of them became the leaders in the civil rights movement, and they went into these local communities and they physically fought back. I mean, for the first, because the first time they had training, in the military, they had weapons. And so King is trying to convince a group of men in particular who have learned that, you know, we have the means now, but we can defend ourselves. And you up here talking about nonviolence. And I think Thurman instilled that in King so strongly that King was able to hold on to that determination that this is the path to follow, that we will gain our rights through a nonviolent path and not necessarily through defending yourself or fighting back. And so, again, I do think King was deeply inspired by Thurman, But I also think Thurman was inspired by King as well. I do think, you know, the question was asked about their relationship, did it continue? It's powerful to me for Thurman to initiate the encounter they had when King was stabbed. He said King just came into his heart and wouldn't leave. So he was really thinking about King, and I think King was always a part of it because he approved of what King was doing in the civil rights movement. He says, you know, if I can be of support to you, a spiritual advisor to you, but I think King had gotten what he needed from Thurman. And again, because of the responsibilities of the movement, he was able to sustain it. And one other thing along that line I would say, I do think King learned that you have to have those things that give you peace inside, because we know about King's calling to Mahalia Jackson. When he was down, he would call to Mahalia Jackson and say, just sing to me over the phone. They helped me to revitalize myself. And I think that's part of Thurman's influence. Say, find those things that feed you, that help you to connect with the spiritual.
I have a quick question. Thank you for all of that. This has been wonderful. In the documentary, it shows Oprah Winfrey speaking and using the quote that you just shared, Jimmy, about finding your passion and, you know, living, you know, becoming alive. And then in the article about the documentary, it talks about that Oprah Winfrey piece being part of prosperity gospel. And I am not seeing that connection in terms of Thurman, and that he would profess to do something to benefit your wealth or your well-being. He was all about, if I'm understanding this, the good in the world and the social justice in the world, not your own wealth. Is that right? Yeah. So I was confused by that piece of the article.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to reread that because I missed that when I saw it, because I think he would definitely refute prosperity gospel. It was, you know, wealth and material wealth, and none of that was of really a vital importance in your walk with God. As a matter of fact, he says that that's part of the problems why people are oppressed. It's because of the desire for prosperity and power and wealth. And so I think we could challenge on the right of the article on that stance.
And maybe they were thinking because of Oprah Winfrey's great wealth, but I even see her saying to this class, this graduation, do good, you know, find your passion and live. You know, we need people who are alive.
Yeah. I'm going to reread that, Scotty, and re-examine it, because I missed that the first time, because I think that would definitely be worth our challenging this, and all that connection is not there.
I want to take this opportunity to thank Jimmy Hawkins. Will you all join with me? What a wonderful a session this has been, Jimmy, and we really appreciate all that you've put into it to make it happen. And also a reminder that our spirituality is not disconnected from our social action. You know, people try to separate involvement in politics and in the life from spirituality. But what you reminded us is that it's a source of strength of our involvement. And I'm sure if somebody like you who's on the front line in Washington knows the need for that. And we pray you'll find your own spiritual strength to go along.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to remind you all that we're going to meet again next week. And next week, we will have a wonderful session because the Reverend Mindy Douglas and the Reverend Lakeisha Bradshaw Easter are going to talk about how this whole business of involvement in the community affects them as they are leading congregations during this very, what can I call it? We can call it all kinds of things. Very stressful time in our life as a people. Mindy, if you and Lakeisha have anything you want us to read beforehand, let us know. I do know one thing that we can find out some about next week. The Reverend Mindy Douglas is very active in the North Carolina Council of Churches, which is another way in which Christians are trying to express their faith in a public manner. And so maybe, Mindy, you can share some of that with us too next time. And
we look forward to it.
It's really a joy to be with you, and I really appreciate it. And Jimmy, we're indebted to you deeply.
Thanks for
That
having
was
me.
very moving in the way in which you did. And Jimmy, you know how to use all those PowerPoints and things. It's amazing.
Hey, look, I feel like I'm getting paid for using PowerPoint now.
You're getting paid to use PowerPoint. Mindy, do you have anything you want to add at the end?
No, thanks for being here.
All right, blessings and peace to you all. And
Thank you.
things are really getting exciting, scary, whatever in the political world. But we've got less than 10 days now before we will have this long nightmare over, I hope. But
Vote, vote, vote.
vote. Yeah, everybody vote.
Yeah. Vote, vote, vote.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.